This short video will review the parts of a research paper. I will not be going into detail about how to create each part. This is just going to be an introduction to what the major parts are so you know what to look for when you're reading and to get you ready for writing. Research papers are different than standard essays that you might do in classes such as an English class. The research paper has a defined structure that's used by almost all researchers for almost all journal publications when folks are trying to publish original research. Those parts are an abstract, which is rather short, an introduction, a method, a results, a discussion, and a page of the references used in the paper. We'll start with an overview of the abstract. Though the abstract comes first in a paper, it's actually written last. That's because it summarizes each of the key sections of a paper in about 1 to 2 sentences. The abstract is rather short. Usually it's recommended that it be about 120 words or less for journals in the behavioral sciences, though some will have specifications up to approximately 300 words. So the abstract is usually only about a quarter to maybe a half a page long if you're using standard 12-point font and double spacing. The abstract gives enough information for a reader to decide if the paper they're looking at is relevant to them. When we're trying to conduct research, we spend a lot of time first looking through articles to find what's already been done in the field. We want to know what research has been conducted because we're going to use that to write our introduction. Therefore, the abstract is kept short to help readers quickly identify whether the article is relevant to the research they're hoping to do themselves. When we wish to write our own paper and conduct research, we start by reviewing what's already known in the literature. That means we're reviewing other papers similar to the one that we're hoping to write. Therefore, a key aspect of the introduction is to introduce what the variables are going to be in the current study. That would be the independent variable or independent variables, and dependent variable or dependent variables, if there are plenty of them. It also is the place where we'll hypothesize what we believe the connection between the independent and dependent variables will be. Therefore, when you read an introduction, you should notice a lot of summaries of previous research with citations. And those citations, for our purposes, will be in APA format because that's the format used for the behavioral sciences. We'll talk more about APA format in a separate video. A very specific flow is used when writing an introduction. We start with broad statements, that is general statements, and then we start to narrow into the specifics. Therefore, the first paragraph of the introduction is generally fairly broad, whereas the last sentence will be a clear statement of the current research hypothesis. So the key functions of the introduction are to review previous research, to build a rationale leading to the current hypothesis. When you're skimming a research paper and trying to find its hypothesis, it should typically be stated overtly in the abstract and also at the end of the introduction, though you'll sometimes see people put it at the beginning of their introductions as well. Now on to the method. The method section actually has 3 subsections. That's because the method has a lot of information to provide. This is the section of the paper where we detail the study design that was used and how the data were collected. Let's look at each of the subsections of the method one by one. The first is the participants section. The only information that belongs in the participants section is details about from whom data were collected in the study. We don't say anything about how the data were collected in the participants section because that's part of something called the procedure. The second subsection is called the measures section. The measures or instrument section is where we provide details about the instruments or tools that were used to gather data. For example, if I used the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a survey, to learn about people's depression, I would tell you all about the Beck Depression Inventory, when it was created, by whom it was created, with citations in the measures section. The participants section almost never has citations because it's usually not referring to anything from previous research. It's only detailing from whom current study data were collected. But because the measures are something that were typically made by someone else that we're using, or made by someone else and we adapted it for our current use, we will provide citations to those original creators, that is, old studies, in the measures section when necessary. The third and final subsection of the method is the procedures section. This can be rather short to very lengthy. It depends on the methods used. If we do a quick survey where we send people a link online, we're probably only going to have a paragraph or two of information about how those folks were identified and how their data were collected and secured. But if we're using a complex procedure, like we're conducting an experiment, then we might actually end up going on for pages detailing information here. The important part of the procedure section is that we provide enough information that if someone else wanted to repeat our study, a process called replication, that they would be able to do so. Essentially, we're giving them the blueprint to how to do the study we did if they wish to do it themselves. When you read someone else's paper, therefore, when you read the methods, you should know from whom data were collected, what was used to collect the data, and the process by which those data were collected. Those are respectively the participants, measures, and procedures components of a paper. The next big section of the paper is the results section. This is the statistics section. If you took Statistics 101 and you learned how to write up results in APA format, what you were actually learning how to do was write the results section of a research paper. There are two things that need to be done in a results section. We need to detail the analytic procedure that was used. That's when we're saying things like correlation or hierarchical regression or ANOVA or MANOVA. We're naming an analysis that was used. And we also say what was found. This means we're telling what the results were from the data using the analytic procedure, whether those results were significant, and sometimes also the size of the effect found in the results. However, we do not interpret the meaning of the results in the results section. That belongs in the discussion. The discussion section is where we put our conclusion and future directions. We typically start the discussion by stating whether the hypothesis was supported. This is also the section of the paper where we'll tell what the findings mean in light of studies detailed in the introduction. So as we are reading a paper or writing a research paper, we start broad in the introduction, narrow down to the hypothesis. Then we stay narrow in the methods and results because those are only about what was done in the current study. In the discussion, we still start narrow by saying whether a hypothesis was supported, but then we start to broaden back out. The introduction and the discussion are the two broadest sections of the paper. So the discussion will tell us the way the current findings either supported or refuted findings of previously mentioned research. Therefore, you're going to see a lot of those citations again in the discussion. We should see most, if not all, of the citations of the introduction reintroduced here in the discussion because this is the connection, the wrapping it all up section of the paper. The final component of the discussion is a summary of the limitations in the current study and the future directions. Every study design has its strengths and its weaknesses, so we typically end our papers by acknowledging the weaknesses of the current study and providing instruction of what should be done next by researchers to help improve our knowledge about the subject detailed in the paper. That is, what do we think should be tested next, and how should it be tested to overcome the limitations of current and previous work. The final section of the paper is the references. The references page provides an APA format reference for every citation used anywhere in the paper. The reference page serves two purposes. It allows a reader to go back and find any of the previous research they would like to read themselves that was cited in the current paper, and it also ensures that proper credit is given to those persons for their work and for their ideas. The proper citation and proper referencing of all sources used is necessary to avoid plagiarism when we're writing our papers. To summarize, the abstract is a short summary that indicates in about 1 to 2 sentences what each section of the paper will tell us. The introduction tells us about previous research and indicates what the current hypothesis is. The methods section tells us how data were collected. It specifies the participants, that is, from whom data were collected, the measures, that means tools that were used to collect the data, and the procedures, the processes by which the data were collected. The results section tells us how the data were analyzed and what was found. The discussion tells us whether the hypothesis was supported, what this might mean in relation to previous research that was cited in the introduction, what the limitations were of the current study, and future directions. And finally, the references tell us all the information about the articles that were cited anywhere in the paper.